At 11:32 p.m. UTC on July the 28th, a Reuters alert carried a sentence that would have sounded almost impossible a few years ago. Iran had launched multiple ballistic missiles toward U.S. forces in the Middle East, and U.S. Central Command said every one of them was intercepted, not a diplomatic warning, not a weapons test. A real ballistic missile attack during an active war, followed by a defensive claim that none of the missiles reached their intended target. That does not mean Iran has no missiles left. It does not mean American defenses are impenetrable. It means something more important has changed. The strategic value of Iran's ballistic arsenal is being attacked at every point in the chain, from the factory floor and underground storage site to the launcher, the command network, the flight path, and finally the target itself. And that is the part hidden by the headline, because America's real advantage here is not one secret interceptor or one mysterious radar. It is an architecture. I'm going to walk you through exactly how that architecture works, why Iran's missile force was always more dependent on launch capacity and command continuity than raw missile numbers suggested, and why the next phase of this conflict may be decided not by who owns the most missiles, but by who can still detect, decide, launch, reload, intercept, and replace weapons under sustained pressure. Stay with me for all of it. A quick word on how I'm approaching this. I'm not going to pretend that public reporting gives us a complete picture of classified US or Iranian capabilities. It doesn't. What we do have is a combination of official CENTCOM statements, public U.S. Army information on systems such as Patriot, independent reporting on missile and interceptor inventories, and the visible sequence of strikes and counterstrikes since the war began on February 28, 2026. Where something is officially confirmed, I'll tell you. Where a number comes from open source estimates, I'll make that distinction. And where I'm drawing a professional inference from the pattern of operations, I'll say so plainly. No hype, no speculation dressed up as fact. Let's get into it. To understand why Iran's ballistic missile force can be dramatically degraded without every missile being destroyed, you have to stop thinking of a missile as a weapon sitting by itself in a tunnel. A ballistic missile is the final visible piece of a much longer machine. That machine begins with manufacturing. Solid propellant has to be produced to exact tolerances. Guidance packages have to be assembled. Warheads have to be mated. Transporter erector launchers have to be available. Storage facilities have to remain accessible. Commanders need authorization. Communications networks have to move orders. Crews have to disperse without being detected. Survey data and targeting information have to be available. Launchers have to reach a viable firing location, erect the missile, complete procedures, fire, survive, relocate, reload, and repeat. Break enough links in that sequence, and a country can still own missiles while losing the ability to generate the volume of fire those missiles were supposed to create. That distinction is everything. Iran built its ballistic force because missiles solved a strategic problem. For decades, Tehran faced adversaries with superior combat aircraft, better access to advanced avionics, stronger aerial refueling, more capable intelligence networks, and in the case of the United States, the ability to project air power from multiple directions. A large missile inventory gave Iran a way to hold distant air bases, cities, ports, energy infrastructure, command centers, and logistics hubs at risk without having to win an air war first. In other words, Iran's ballistic arsenal was not just an explosive inventory, it was substitute air power. That is the first recontextualizing surprise. When people hear Iranian missiles, they often imagine a collection of rockets whose value is measured by range, speed, and warhead size. But strategically, the arsenal mattered because it compensated for weaknesses elsewhere. If your air force cannot reliably penetrate an opponent's defenses, a ballistic missile can deliver destructive force hundreds of kilometers away without asking a pilot to survive the trip. That made the missile force central to deterrence. But deterrence requires credibility. An opponent has to believe three things at once. You can launch, enough weapons will survive the defensive screen, and you can keep doing it after the enemy shoots back. Lose any one of those assumptions, and deterrence begins to degrade. Now, let's talk about the defensive side. The United States does not rely on a single system to stop ballistic missiles. Patriot, especially the PAC-3 family, occupies one layer. THAAD provides another layer against ballistic threats. Aegis-capable warships can contribute using standard missile interceptors. The systems can be linked to wider command and control and sensor architectures, so incoming threats can be detected, tracked, assigned, and engaged. The U.S. Army describes PAC-3 MSE as a hit-to-kill interceptor designed against tactical ballistic missiles, cruise missiles, and aircraft, while the Navy describes Aegis BMD and SM-3 as a system built to track and intercept ballistic threats. That word layered gets used so often that it can become meaningless, so here is what it really means. It means the defender is trying to create more than one chance to kill the same threat. If a missile can potentially be engaged earlier by one system, later by another, and in some cases by terminal defense closer to the defended asset, then Iran is no longer testing one interceptor. It is testing a chain of sensors, algorithms, operators, batteries, ships, and command links. But here is the piece almost nobody's explaining correctly. The most powerful layer may not be an interceptor at all. It may be the strike that prevents the next missile from leaving the ground. Missile defense is usually presented as a race in the sky. Radar sees a launch, an interceptor fires. Two objects close at extraordinary speed. One survives. That is only the last portion of the fight. The broader U.S. campaign has repeatedly targeted missile and drone sites, ammunition storage, communications networks, coastal surveillance, command facilities, and other military infrastructure. CENTCOM said that on July 11th alone, U.S. forces struck roughly 140 Iranian military targets, including missile and drone sites and communications networks. CENTCOM later described a much larger cumulative campaign against the industrial base, storage sites, launch systems, and command and control structures supporting Iranian power projection. That changes the economics of defense. Imagine Iran has 100 missiles available for a planned wave. If the United States waits for all 100 to launch, every defensive problem becomes harder. Radars must track more objects. Commanders must prioritize. Interceptor magazines empty faster. Leakage becomes more likely. The cost exchange can become brutal because sophisticated defensive missiles are scarce and expensive. But if surveillance, air power, long-range precision weapons, electronic attack, and partner intelligence reduce the launchable force before the salvo begins, the defender is not trying to defeat 100 missiles anymore. Maybe it is 60, maybe 40, maybe fewer. The exact number is classified and dynamic. The mechanism is not. Kill the launcher, and the missile in storage may become irrelevant for that battle. Destroy a communications node, and a launcher may survive physically but lose timely orders. Damage a tunnel entrance, and weapons can remain intact underground, while being trapped when they are needed. Strike a production facility, and today's magazine may still exist, but tomorrow's replacement inventory shrinks. Force crews to move constantly, and sortie generation slows. Dominate the airspace, and every movement above ground becomes a risk. A depends on B depends on C. Break enough of C, and A collapses. That is how an arsenal becomes less useful without becoming empty. There is also a second dependency, salvo density. Ballistic missiles are most dangerous when they arrive in combinations that stress a defensive network. A defender facing only a handful of incoming threats has a fundamentally different problem from a defender facing a large coordinated wave. The attacker therefore gains leverage not merely from owning missiles, but from launching enough weapons, close enough together, against the right targets, with enough variation to complicate the defense. This is why launchers matter so much. A warehouse full of missiles does not generate a saturation attack by itself. Transporter erector launchers, fixed launch infrastructure where applicable trained crews, survival communications, and a functioning command system convert inventory into launch rate. The launch rate converts inventory into pressure. Pressure creates leakage, and leakage creates strategic effect. So when CENTCOM says it struck hundreds of ballistic missile storage and system targets and says large portions of Iran's missile-related industrial base were damaged or destroyed, the meaningful question is not simply how many missiles are left. CENTCOM claims more than 450 strikes against ballistic missile storage and systems during the major phase of Operation Epic Fury, and says extensive damage was inflicted on Iran's missile-related industrial base. The meaningful question is, how many coordinated missiles can Iran still put into the air against a defended target set, inside a short enough window to overwhelm the network, and how many times can it repeat that cycle? That is a far harder question, and it is the question on which the entire title of this story turns, because Iran's arsenal is not useless if one missile can still kill soldiers. We have already seen that it is not useless in that literal sense. Iranian attacks have caused casualties, and U.S. officials have acknowledged deadly strikes during this war. But a weapon can remain deadly while becoming less strategically reliable. A revolver with one round is still deadly. It is not the same coercive instrument as a loaded machine gun. That is the difference. Now follow the timeline, because the sequence shows the architecture much more clearly than any weapons brochure ever could. The war began on February 28th, when the United States and Israel launched Operation Epic Fury against Iran. CENTCOM said the opening targets included Iranian air defenses, missile and drone launch sites, and military airfields. That choice tells you the campaign logic immediately. Air defenses had to be suppressed to expand freedom of action. Launch infrastructure had to be attacked to reduce retaliation. Airfields and other military nodes had to be degraded to prevent Iran from contesting the air campaign conventionally. 3 tracks began moving at once. Track 1 was offensive counterforce. Find and destroy the systems Iran needed to fire back. Track 2 was defensive interception. Protect U.S. forces, Israel partners, and key infrastructure from weapons that survived the counterforce campaign and still launched. Track 3 was endurance. Keep enough aircraft, interceptors, precision munitions, crews, spare parts, and industrial capacity available to continue the contest longer than Iran could sustain its own. Those 3 tracks are the whole war in miniature. The first phase delivered extraordinary levels of destructive pressure according to CENTCOM's own posture statement. The command says that over 38 days of major combat operations, U.S. forces in Israel generated more than 10,200 sorties and more than 13,500 strikes. It says over 85% of Iran's ballistic missile, drone, and naval defense industrial base was damaged or destroyed, that more than 450 strikes hit ballistic missile storage and systems, and that more than 2,000 strikes hit command and control structures. Those are U.S. military claims. They should be understood as such. But even if you treat them cautiously, the operational concept is unmistakable. This was not a campaign built around shooting missiles down one by one. It was built around dismantling the ecosystem that makes mass missile fire possible. Then came the test of whether that degradation was permanent. It wasn't. Iran continued to demonstrate residual missile and drone capability. That matters because it exposes the weakness in the most sensational version of the story. You cannot say the missile threat simply vanished. Tehran retained enough launch capability and command continuity to keep striking, including attacks that caused U.S. casualties. In July, after renewed U.S. strikes, the contest accelerated again. On July 11th, CENTCOM said U.S. forces hit approximately 140 Iranian military targets using land and sea-based aircraft, drones, and naval weapons. The target list again included missile and drone sites, ammunition storage, communications networks, and coastal surveillance. CENTCOM said that across 3 nights that week, more than 300 targets were struck. Notice the repetition: missile sites, storage, communications, surveillance, the same dependencies over and over. Then on July 17th, Iranian missiles struck a base in Jordan that hosted U.S. forces. American service members were killed. That single event destroys any lazy claim that Iran's arsenal had become harmless. The missiles were still lethal. And critically, that attack reinforced the American incentive to push harder on both sides of the kill chain, intercept what launches, and strike the machinery that makes the next launch possible. Roughly 10 days later came the episode that gives this story its sharpest contrast. On July 28th, Iran launched multiple ballistic missiles toward U.S. forces in what CENTCOM described as an attempted surprise attack. Reuters reported that CENTCOM said all of those missiles were successfully intercepted. Same adversary, same broad class of weapon, completely different outcome. That does not prove a perfect shield. It proves that the result of a missile attack depends on far more than the missile itself. Where did the launch occur? Which trajectory did the missile use? Which target was selected? How much warning was available? Which sensors were positioned to contribute? What defensive systems were ready to engage? How many missiles arrived together? What was the readiness state of the batteries and ships? How many interceptors were commanders prepared to expend? A missile defense system is not a force field. It is a decision network operating under time pressure. Here's the piece almost nobody's explaining correctly. The attacker and defender are each trying to break the other's decision cycle. Iran wants to compress warning time, create ambiguity, launch enough weapons to force hard choices, and make the United States spend expensive interceptors faster than it can replace them. The United States wants to expand warning time, reduce the number of launchers available, classify trajectories quickly, protect the most valuable targets, and force Iran to spend scarce surviving missiles for little strategic return. That is why the July 28th interception mattered beyond the immediate defense. If Tehran fires a scarce ballistic missile and the missile is destroyed before reaching the target, Iran loses more than one weapon. It loses a piece of a diminished inventory, consumes crew effort, and potentially provides information about the continued operation of its residual launch network. One failed attack can therefore create multiple costs. Then the cycle begins again. After the July 28th attack, the United States carried out another wave of strikes. Reuters reported that a subsequent 2-hour operation hit dozens of IRGC targets, including command centers and missile and drone facilities. In other words, an Iranian launch was followed not only by defensive interception, but by renewed offensive pressure on the system behind the launch. That is the secret in plain sight. Detect, defend, attribute, strike back, repeat. But there's a catch, and it is a huge one. Every interception costs the defender something too. Patriot missiles are not infinite. THAAD interceptors are not infinite. Standard missiles aboard Aegis ships are not infinite. Crews require maintenance and readiness. Launchers and ships have finite magazines. Production lines cannot instantly replace months of wartime expenditure. This is where the entire narrative becomes more dangerous for Washington than the triumphant version suggests. Open source estimates cited by the Associated Press in late July suggested the U.S. Patriot interceptor inventory had fallen from an estimated 2,330 before the war to roughly 759 to 827 after the renewed fighting, a decline of at least 65%. The same analysis estimated THAAD inventory remained at least 38% below its pre-war level. The Pentagon pushed back against suggestions that U.S. forces lacked the capabilities needed to execute their missions. Sustained missile defense is a magazine war. And in a magazine war, the question is not only, can you intercept? It is, how many times can you afford to intercept before the attacker forces you into a worse choice? That is the balance both sides are now trying to manipulate. If this breakdown is giving you the operational logic behind the headlines, instead of just another clip of missiles lifting off and explosions in the distance, do one thing right now. Hit subscribe and ring the notification bell. This story is changing through strikes, negotiations, weapons expenditure, and industrial decisions, and those pieces only make sense when you track them together. Let's zoom out to what this means. The first ripple effect is inside Iran itself. A missile force that has to hide more aggressively becomes a slower missile force. Units disperse, crews reduce signatures, launchers move undercover, communications may become more cautious. Commanders may centralize release authority to prevent unauthorized or poorly coordinated launches, but centralization can slow response. They may decentralize authority to preserve responsiveness, but decentralization creates other risks. Either way, pressure changes behavior. That matters because Iran's strategic missile doctrine benefits from the perception that it can respond rapidly and at scale. If surviving units cannot mass fires without exposing themselves, then the force may become better at sporadic retaliation than at generating sustained theater-wide coercion. That is degradation in strategic terms. The second ripple is national. Iran now has to decide where scarce surviving high-value missiles should go. Against U.S. bases, against Israeli targets, against Gulf energy infrastructure, against ports, against air defense batteries, against command nodes. Every target not chosen is a form of restraint imposed by scarcity. Before severe attrition, Tehran could threaten multiple categories of targets at once and count on the size of the arsenal to create psychological pressure across the region. After repeated strikes on production, storage, launchers, and command networks, the calculus changes. The leadership has to ask whether each launch produces enough military or political effect to justify losing a weapon that may be difficult to replace. That is what coercive power looks like when it starts to unravel. Not silence, selectivity. The third ripple is regional, and this is where Gulf states become crucial. Countries hosting U.S. forces live inside the strategic geography of this conflict. Their airspace, radars, bases, energy infrastructure, ports, and political decisions can affect the defensive picture. A missile fired from Iran toward a U.S. installation in the region is not only a bilateral event between Washington and Tehran. It can involve warning networks, local air defenses, allied command centers, civilian flight corridors, and governments trying desperately to avoid becoming permanent battlefields. That creates a regional network effect. The more partners can effectively share warning, tracking, and air defense information, the harder it becomes for an attacker to exploit seams between national systems. But integration is not automatic. Different countries use different equipment. Political trust varies. Rules for sharing sensitive sensor data can be restrictive. Command authorities remain national. A radar track that exists in one country is only useful to another defensive system if the information can reach the right people and machines fast enough to influence an engagement. This is why the real competition is increasingly about architecture, not platforms. A better missile matters. A better network can matter more. Now, let's talk about Israel, because its role changes the geometry further. Iran has to assume that a large ballistic salvo may face a combination of Israeli defenses, U.S. systems, and coordination between them, while launch sites and command nodes inside Iran may themselves become targets. That creates a two-sided pressure problem, surviving the outbound flight and surviving the response to having launched. The same broad logic applies to U.S. warships. An Aegis-capable destroyer is not merely another launcher in the defense. It is a mobile component of the missile defense architecture. U.S. Navy descriptions of Aegis BMD explain that the system can receive tracking information, develop firing solutions, and launch SM-3 interceptors against ballistic threats. Mobility can change defensive geometry, but ships still have finite magazines and maintenance requirements. Again, there is no magic. There is management. The fourth ripple is global because the war is consuming weapons the United States also needs for other theaters. That is not a side story. That may be the defining strategic constraint. The Patriot family is heavily demanded across U.S. and allied defense planning. High-end missile defense also figures into preparations for other potential theaters. Long-range precision weapons used to strike Iranian targets are likewise part of inventories American planners would want available in another major conflict. Reuters reported in early August that the United States had used much of its inventory of certain long-range precision missiles in the Iran war, including what sources described as virtually all available ATAC-EMS and PRSM stocks. Separate open-source estimates have documented heavy expenditure of Patriot and THAAD interceptors. If those estimates are even broadly correct, that America's advantage in the kill chain has an industrial clock attached to it. That is the uncomfortable part. The United States can destroy launchers faster than Iran can use them only if U.S. intelligence can keep finding militarily relevant targets. U.S. forces can keep applying pressure, and U.S. magazines can keep supplying the campaign. Iran can stress American defenses only if it can preserve enough launch capacity and enough missiles to keep generating threats faster than defensive inventories, and readiness can absorb them. Both sides are trying to make the other one run out first, run out of interceptors, run out of launchers, run out of precision strike weapons, run out of trained crews, run out of political patience. That last one may be the most important, because military effectiveness is not measured in isolation from political objectives. If Iran can no longer reliably devastate U.S. bases with ballistic missiles, but can still keep the Strait of Hormuz unstable, threaten Gulf energy infrastructure, impose recurring defense costs, and create enough danger to disrupt global energy flows, then Tehran can still exert strategic pressure even with a degraded missile force. As of mid-August, the conflict around Hormuz and the broader U.S.-Iran confrontation remain unresolved. That is why Iran's ballistic arsenal just became useless, is not literally the conclusion. The more accurate conclusion is harsher and more interesting. Iran may be losing the ability to use ballistic missiles as a dependable, scalable shield behind which it can coerce the region without inviting devastating counterforce pressure. That is not the same thing as disarmament. It is the erosion of confidence. And deterrence lives or dies on confidence. This is also where the same issue we covered in our last analysis of U.S. operations around the Strait of Hormuz comes back into the picture. Military control in one domain does not automatically produce strategic victory in another. You can dominate the air and still struggle at sea. You can destroy missile factories and still face residual launches. You can intercept a salvo and still spend scarce weapons doing it. Tactical success and strategic closure are not the same thing. That distinction is essential because both Washington and Tehran have incentives to exaggerate. Washington wants allies, domestic audiences, and Iran to believe its campaign has dismantled Tehran's ability to retaliate effectively. Tehran wants its own population, partners, and adversaries to believe it can still impose unacceptable costs no matter how many facilities are struck. Both narratives can contain pieces of truth. Neither should be accepted whole. Now look at the industrial response in the United States. The Army announced in April that the U.S. government awarded a $4.7 billion contract action to support accelerated PAC-3 MSE interceptor production. The Army explicitly tied the move to expanded production capacity and operational demand. That tells you the Pentagon does not view missile defense demand as a temporary abstraction. It is trying to increase throughput because a layered architecture is only credible if the launchers have rounds to fire. The PAC-3 MSE is a hit-to-kill interceptor designed to counter tactical ballistic missiles, cruise missiles, and aircraft. That is an extraordinary technical capability, but the strategic capability is production. A missile on a factory line today can become deterrence later. A production bottleneck can become vulnerability long before a radar detects the next inbound threat. This is why defense industrial capacity has moved from background policy discussion to frontline warfighting variable. Factories are now part of the order of battle. Supply chains are part of the order of battle. Skilled labor is part of the order of battle. Rocket motors, seekers, electronics, energetic materials, test capacity, shipping, depot maintenance, and contracting speed are part of the order of battle. The side that understands this only after the shooting starts is already behind. Iran faces the same problem under even heavier pressure. If key missile production facilities are damaged, specialized equipment destroyed, technical personnel killed or dispersed, imported components disrupted, and transportation networks watched, then replacing a ballistic missile is not simply a matter of spending money. Industrial ecosystems have memory. Destroy enough of that memory and recovery slows, but it does not stop forever. Iran has spent decades building missile expertise and infrastructure, and CENTCOM itself says the results of its campaign will not be permanent without continued vigilance. Its posture statement explicitly warns that Iran will attempt to reconstitute what it can, and says the pace of that recovery will depend partly on whether outside actors help Tehran rebuild. That sentence may be more important than the dramatic damage claims, because it admits the central reality. The last door is not closed. Iran can adapt. It can rely on smaller salvos. It can mix ballistic missiles with drones and cruise missiles. It can shift emphasis toward less defended forms of pressure. It can preserve premium weapons for moments of political shock rather than routine use. It can emphasize proxies and maritime disruption. It can try to rebuild launch infrastructure. It can seek foreign assistance or substitute simpler systems that trade sophistication for production speed. The United States can adapt too. It can improve sensor fusion. It can disperse forces. It can harden bases. It can use deception. It can reserve high-end interceptors for high-end threats while using cheaper defenses where appropriate. It can deepen partner integration. It can accelerate production. And at the policy level, it can continue trying to reduce the threat before launch, rather than relying entirely on expensive interception afterward. That action-reaction cycle is why there will never be a permanent technological finish line. Every shield creates incentives for a different spear. Every spear creates demand for a different shield. And now, I want to be honest with you about something. It is easy to talk about all of this as an engineering problem. Launch rate, interceptor inventory, kill chain, sortie generation, magazine depth. But every one of those terms is attached to human beings. A ballistic missile that penetrates a defensive screen does not hit a spreadsheet. It hits a base, a port, a neighborhood, a power station, a road, or a building. The service members killed in Jordan are not evidence in an argument about whether one side's technology is superior. They are people whose families live permanently with the outcome of a few minutes in a missile engagement. The same is true for civilians across the countries touched by this conflict. Reuters has reported thousands killed and millions displaced in the broader fighting involving Iran and the region, and uncertainty makes that danger worse. Public statements in wartime are selective. Battle damage assessments change. Missile inventories are classified. Governments highlight successful interceptions and may say less about failures. Attackers emphasize penetration and may conceal launch problems. Open source analysts work with fragments. So there is a moral and analytical discipline required here. We should not confuse destruction with resolution. We should not confuse interception with invulnerability. We should not confuse a degraded Iranian arsenal with a harmless Iran. And we should not confuse American tactical superiority with an unlimited ability to sustain war at acceptable cost. Understanding why the U.S. kill chain can dramatically reduce Iran's missile leverage does not require pretending Iranian missiles cannot still kill people. Both things are true at once. Here's where we stand. At 11:32 p.m. UTC on July 28th, the world saw that Reuters alert multiple Iranian ballistic missiles launched toward U.S. forces, with CENTCOM saying everyone was intercepted. That moment was not proof of an invisible force field. It was a snapshot of a much larger system working at once. The missile had to survive before launch. The launcher had to survive. The crew had to receive orders. The command network had to function. The missile had to get airborne. The trajectory had to make it through the warning and tracking architecture. The salvo had to stress the defensive network. And after all of that, the weapon still had to survive whichever Patriot, THAAD, Aegis, Israeli, or other allied defensive systems were positioned and authorized for that specific engagement. Meanwhile, U.S. and allied forces have spent months attacking the other side of the equation. Factories, storage, launch infrastructure, air defenses, communications, command nodes, and the wider military system that turns a missile inventory into sustained combat power. CENTCOM's posture statement describes strikes against all of those broader supporting elements. That is America's exposed secret. It is not one secret weapon. It is the integration of offense and defense. Shoot down what gets through. Destroy or suppress what can still launch. Disrupt the network connecting the pieces. Then use industrial capacity to regenerate your own magazines before the enemy regenerates theirs. Simple to describe. Extremely difficult to sustain. And the evidence that Iran's missile force is degraded is substantial. CENTCOM claims enormous damage to missile-related industrial infrastructure, storage, systems, and command networks. Repeated U.S. strikes in July continued to target missile and drone facilities. On July 28th, CENTCOM said an Iranian ballistic attack was completely intercepted. But the evidence against triumphalism is substantial too. Iranian missiles have killed U.S. personnel during this war. Tehran retains the capacity to threaten bases and regional infrastructure. It continues to influence the strategic environment around the Strait of Hormuz. And the United States has burned through large quantities of the very interceptors and precision weapons needed to sustain this advantage. So the real contest is not over whether Iran owns ballistic missiles. It does. The contest is over whether Tehran can still turn those missiles into reliable political leverage faster than Washington, and its allies can detect, suppress, intercept, retaliate, and replenish. That is a very different question. And right now, the evidence suggests the balance has shifted against Iran in the narrow military sense, while remaining dangerously unresolved in the wider strategic sense. If this gave you the operational picture you cannot get from a 30-second headline clip, share it right now with someone trying to actually understand what is happening, instead of just watching explosions scroll past. And here is the question I want you to wrestle with. If Iran's missile force becomes less capable of overwhelming U.S. and allied defenses, but America has to burn through a huge share of its own high-end weapons to keep that advantage, which side is actually winning the long game? The side losing launch capacity, or the side spending global stockpiles to suppress it? Drop your take below. I read every comment. And hit like if this analysis delivered real value. Because the next update on this story will not be decided by the next dramatic missile video alone. Watch the production contracts, the surviving launch tempo, the pace of U.S. counterstrikes, the state of defensive inventories, and the negotiations around the Strait of Hormuz. That is where you will see whether Iran's ballistic arsenal is truly collapsing as a strategic instrument, or simply changing shape for the next round.